archaeologists have tended to develop a more technical terminology for it. Carvel-built boats aren't called that anymore in ship archaeology. They're called shell-constructed. And the basic principle is this: you build the shell first, the keel, the stem, the stern, then you add what we call the ribs, the supporting structure. You build them all up, and then you nail the planks to the supporting ribs. So that's where you build the skeleton first. In shell construction, it's the opposite. You put the keel down, you put the stem post in, and actually you build the shell of the boat before you put the internal timbers in. They're nailed to each other, and I'll show you a close-up example of how that's done. When you've got the whole shape basically made, like a peapod I suppose, then you put the ribs in and all the strengthening timbers. And this is a close-up of it. Keel, stem post, stern post, planks joined to each other and shaped very often by eye, although in St Ives the boat builders tended to put a mould where you build the timbers around it to give you the right shape. But all these planks are joined edge to edge. When you've got the whole shape made, you insert the floor timbers and then the stringers and the gunnels to strengthen the boat. And this is an example of what a clinker-built boat looks like if you cut them in half. Start with the keel down there, that's the gunnel, the top plank up there, and you can see each plank overlaps the plank below it, and they're nailed through there. And the next slide shows you how they're nailed. Interesting technique, it's called a clenched nail. The nail head is round, it's driven in from the outside, that's the outside, this is the inside. The nail is driven through both planks. Where the planks overlap, traditionally, they would have been caulked using horsehair and tar or some similar material to make the join waterproof. When the nail is driven through from the outside, it passes the point of the nail, the tip, passes over a washer, which is called a rove. And when it's passed through, the point of the nail is cut off. Somebody holds a dolly against the head of the nail, and that's beaten flat. So basically what you end up is a nail closed at both ends, keeping the planks together. All very clever. Traditionally, they were in boat building in recent years, they use copper because it's soft enough to hammer easily. So that's what a clenched nail and a clinker-built boat looks like in the process of being built. This is a picture I took a couple of years ago up in Donegal, McDonald's in Inishowen. They are still building double-ended clinker-built wooden boats at McDonald's yard in Moville in County Donegal. And you can see that that basic technique hasn't changed really for well over 1,000 years. Now, the question that next is written is, how did the clinker-built boat come to be developed? And these two characters, Shetteleg and Brugger, were the great godfathers of Scandinavian archaeology, and they questioned exactly that thing of how did this clinker-built boat come to be developed, and they come up with two theories. One, they were developed from skin boats, or two, were they developed from wooden plank-built boats. The obvious thing would be wooden plank-built boats, but it's not quite as simple as that. You might think if you're going to undergo a sea voyage that you'd much rather be in a plank boat than in a skin boat. Well, that's only a simplification of what actually happened. We know that on the west of Ireland, where the landscape is virtually treeless, the tradition of building skin boats actually continued right up until 100 years ago. And a few years ago, I took this photograph of the Bantry pillar down in the southwest of Ireland, Bantry in County Cork, and you can see it's actually the vertical shaft of a cross. Now, Irish crosses are often very ornamented, and they're carved in relief. And I've got the next slide, shows you this on its side, and it's been badly weathered. In fact, I was lucky to get this photograph. The conditions just kind of favoured photography. And what you can see is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 oarsmen, a steersman, a cross there, because these are religious crosses. Obviously, as I say, they're high crosses ornamented, and it's pointing heavenward, so it depicts a journey of the departed souls to a better place. And the question is, what sort of vessel is depicted? Is it a skin boat? or is it a wooden boat? Because, as I say, it's in the treeless areas of the west of Ireland, building wooden boats pose quite a problem. Well, what I would just point out to you at the moment is the shape of this vessel, and then when I show you the next slide, this is a curragh from County Galway. And County Galway curraghs were used right through really prehistory, because they say the area is fairly treeless. Curraghs are not like the Welsh corrigals. They aren't small, rounded river craft. These are seagoing vessels. And the great Irish playwright J.M. Synge lived on the Aran Islands off the coast of County Galway for much of his life, and he wrote some quite detailed accounts of the fishermen and the seafarers from the Aran Islands going into County Galway and into Galway itself, and actually even putting cattle on board their curraghs, bringing them across to the islands. So these vessels actually were used to carry quite bulky objects and to travel quite long distances. And there is more than a little evidence. This is a picture of them being built. This is a hide being stretched over a wooden framework, and they would be fastened, and then they would be tarred in some way in order to make them tougher and dry and waterproof. And the next slide shows you, or doesn't show you, I'll have to read it to you. This is an Icelandic text written by a man called Ari Thorpilsson in the 1120s, and it's written in Old Icelandic. And what he says here is quite interesting. He says, this is from the Islanda book, is a book about the settlement of Iceland, who were the first people to get to Iceland. And he says, the varuher men kristna, there es Northmen kalla papa. There were living here Christian men who the Norsemen called papa, monks, fathers. And they fóra síðan abroad at vi at the vildu ægir vera here with æthna men. They did not wish, they went abroad because they did not wish to stay here with those heathen men, coming of Norwegians, Vikings. Uch letu ekta buka irska bjola of bagla. After we matter skilja at the varu men irska. And they left behind Irish books written in Irish, and bells, and this is generally translated as crozier. And from the skill of those particular objects, we know these men were Irish. There's evidence to suggest that before the Vikings got to Iceland, and Ari Thorpilsson, the great sort of early historian of Icelandic history, actually says the first people to colonize Iceland were not the Vikings, not the Norsemen, but the Irish, and they would have got there in curraghs. So they voyaged from the west coast of Ireland all the way up through the North Atlantic to land and to colonize Iceland. And just to make sure, or to prove that that was possible, a few years ago, some of you may have seen the TV program that he did, a chap called Tim Severin, who was a kind of an adventurer come explorer, decided that he was going to prove that curraghs could undertake ocean voyages. And there is an Irish source called the Imrama of Brendan, the Voyage of Brendan, and he claimed that Brendan actually probably found America long before Columbus, long before the Vikings. The first people to sail to America, according to Tim Severin, were probably the Irish. And of course they would have used a curragh. So to prove that was feasible, he actually built for himself a curragh, and he rigged it. There's no evidence particularly for the authenticity of this rig. And he wrote a book about it, The Brendan Voyage, and he actually sailed from the west of Ireland across the North Atlantic and actually managed to get to America in about 100 and something days, from what I remember. So this shows you that skin boats could actually undertake ocean voyages. And when we hear the story of, well, classically St. Aya, who allegedly crossed the Irish Sea and arrived in St. Ives to bring, the Christian message across to West Cornwall, and the legend is that she arrived on an ivy leaf, then beyond that sort of folklore story, there probably is more than a grain of truth that she actually probably came in a skin boat, a curragh, and that's how she brought Christianity to West Cornwall. Now, it has in recent years become almost a kind of a commonplace to assume that all the early voyages and the early boat types around West Cornwall were skin boats because of some of the evidence I pointed out. Well, that's a gross oversimplification. We know from this mural, 1450, Brede Church, that wooden boats did actually exist by the medieval period, certainly, and almost certainly earlier than that. But there is evidence that plank boats were also built. This is from the east of Britain, from the Humber, North Ferriby. Basically, plank boats would have been, first of all, a dugout canoe. Now, what dugout canoes lack is height, so water would come in them easily and they would be swamped, but they also actually lack to some extent stability. So you're not going to go very far in ocean voyages in a wooden dugout canoe, because they're not going to rise very fast to waves either. But the North Ferriby boats are interesting because they date to the early Bronze Age, that's, for argument's sake, 1300 BC. And we can see that they were joined, not using metal, they were actually stitched together. And I know you can't see this very well from further back, but actually there are stitches here made of withy and willow roots, and the planks were actually held together by lashings. And these were seagoing vessels. And this illustration shows you the basic design. This is a later one. This is a medieval dugout canoe here. That's the bottom dugout part. And strakes were added until it actually gained height. And this was used, obviously, in the Lake District. But to give you some idea of how large some of these wooden boats were, this is the reconstruction. 3 different boats were found at North Ferriby in the Humber. And you can see that they're quite considerable size. They're huge. They're about 30 foot long, and they have a height from the bottom of the keel to the top gunwale of probably about 5 feet. So these are seagoing wooden boats, held together not by metal, held together by stitching. And close examination showed that the seams were closed up using wooden lathes to limit the amount of water entering between the planks. So we know that in early prehistory there were wooden vessels, very primitive, sailing around the coast of West Cornwall, and skin boats. So the origin of the clinker-built boat probably is a combination of both of them. Shetleg and Brugger were trying to prove that the origin was skin boats, but in actual fact it was probably a combination of both. They were influenced by the techniques that were gleaned from the sewn together wooden boats and also from the currach-type vessels that we've just been looking at. This is another interesting example of an early Cornish vessel. This is from Tintagel, and the excavator Raleigh Radford, who excavated Tintagel, the island site, has never published it. And he's not going to now because he's dead. And this is something of, I wouldn't say a scandal, but really he excavated a large area of Tintagel, and as the great British archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler once said, excavation is destruction. Once you excavate a site, you destroy it. It can never be excavated at all. And even Wheeler, 70 years ago, was saying it is incumbent on every archaeologist to make sure that whatever they excavate is published, because that material is gone forever. Raleigh Radford has never published the Tintagel excavations. I did contact him to ask him a little bit more about where this particular slate. It was a slate fragment, and you can see the graffiti carved on it. I wanted to know where it was found and to give it a date. He informed me without any hesitation that it was certainly early medieval, probably 7th or 8th century, but he was very, very vague about the context for it. So it would appear from his oral evidence to me that it was a very early example. You can see the straight runs of a plank vessel that may well have been sailing the waters around North Cornwall in the 7th century, and there's evidence that it had a single square sail. Again, a religious motive, and that was one of his reasons for dating it, apart from the context, was he said that there are parallels for this cross in Welsh archaeology dated to the 7th century. So, an early example of a plank boat, if that date can be relied on. And that's just an illustration of it, published just, I think, in the Mariner's Mirror, but that's still in the County Museum in Truro if you want to go and look at it. Now, the next question is, okay, how were the boats propelled? Well, virtually all the ones that I've shown you so far, the early ones, were rowed. And again, I pointed out secondary information can come from things like tapestry. You'll all recognize this as the Bayeux tapestry. And you can see that There is evidence from the Bayeux Tapestry that they had a single mast as well, but one of the main means of propulsion was always rowing. There is very little evidence for the use of mast and sail in North European waters until really quite late. So you would think that, you know, the idea of sailing a vessel would have caught on pretty quickly. It's a damn sight easier to sail than it is to row. And the earliest evidence for mast and sail, because of course sails don't survive very well in the archaeological record. So the earliest evidence for mast and sail in North European waters is this rather lovely, curious model that was found in Ireland. It's called the Broiter boat, and it's on display in the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin, and it's made of gold. It was from a gold hoard found up in County Derry, about 10 miles from Londonderry, or Derry itself. And it's very interesting. It's obviously a crude representation of a boat type that would have been contemporary. I was very fortunate in that my professor of archaeology at Queen's was a chap called Martin Jope, who actually was a Cornishman. And Martin Jope was an expert on early or late Iron Age art. And together with this boat, a whole series of gold torques was found, and he was confident that the gold torques dated to the 1st century BC. So the date the 1st century BC was gleaned by the fact that this was found with a pile of other material, the gold hoard, that he was confident he could date to the 1st century BC. So we assume then, by the analogy that this was a sealed hoard, that this boat must be of 1st century BC date, or the model is of 1st century BC date. Now what's interesting about it, very simple design. There's been a lot of debate on whether it represents a plank boat or a skin boat. That's not what really interested me. What interested me was the fact, yes, that it had little gold rowing oars, it had a side rudder. Interestingly, in this particular photograph, it shows it mounted on the port side, but there is there a hole on the other side as well. And I'll come to explain a little bit about steering oars later. But what's of interest is the fact that it's got a mast and a yard. This is the earliest evidence for sail and the use of sail in northern waters. And the first evidence is the 1st century BC. So we have no positive proof or evidence that vessels were sailed around the waters of Britain until the 1st century BC. Up until then, everything would have had to have been rowed. Again, Wood Quay, Viking Age period, we began to find stuff like this, and the excavator didn't have a particular nautical background, wasn't quite sure what this was. He had a feeling it was something to do with the boat, but he didn't know what. And this was also found, this kind of horseshoe-shaped object made of wood. Part of it was broken off there. They didn't know what that was found, or what that was when they found it. It's been preserved now. But the clue is in this medieval manuscript of Edward the Confessor, found in Cambridge Library. And if you look, there's what's called a mast parrel. It's what's fixed to the yard to allow the yard to glide up and down the mast when the sail is hoisted and when it's lowered. And this is in what is called in medieval or Middle English literature a moopke. And it's what the actual backstay is fastened to. So we have pictorial evidence which basically tells us what those wooden timbers were used for. You can see as well, this is almost certainly a clinker-built boat, double-ended, very much still a legacy of the Viking tradition, with animal-headed prow in Anglo-Saxon. These ornamental stem pieces are called ringedstefne. And interestingly again, the oar is always on the starboard side. Now the problem with sailing vessels is this. Sailing vessels do not sail into the wind. So if we assume the wind is coming from this direction, yes, boats can sail away from the wind very readily. Square sail boats, no problem at all. They can even sail on what's called a broad reach at an angle away from the wind. But when you get into this area, sailing towards the wind becomes very, very difficult. And you can't, certainly, there's an area here in grey, this area, which is effectively a no-go area for sailing vessels, because you can't sail smack on into the wind. You can sail close-hauled in some vessels, which means you can get to within certain points of the wind direction. But of course, if you can never get any further than that point towards the wind, then your voyaging is going to be limited. And if you've got prevailing southwesterly winds, as we have here, getting down to the Mediterranean is going to be difficult because you've got headwinds most of the way. And you have to do what's known as tack, zigzag your way down. Now, certain rigs are better at sailing close to the wind than others. And what's always puzzled me is that the prevailing rig that we know was typical in North European waters and around Cornwall was the square rig until really the 13th, 14th century. Of all the sails, this is the least effective sailing into the wind. Now, we glory in the voyages of the Vikings, and we know that they got here as well. We know that they were on the Scillies for a time. There is the story of how they actually formed a consortium with the men of the Scillies and made themselves a nuisance against King Athelstan. And he spent the night, did he not, in Berrien before he went over, according to legend, and did battle with the Vikings and won. And that's why Berrien Church became a royal peculiar. He endowed it because he spent his last night and offered prayers there before the battle. Anyway, whether that's a true story or not is open to conjecture. But we know the Vikings were here, and we know from all the evidence that the Vikings used square sails. Now, we know the Vikings voyaged into the Mediterranean. We know they certainly went to Iceland, to Greenland. They have no doubt about it got as far as America. There are two Icelandic sagas, Erika Rotha saga and Grönlendinga saga, where they describe arriving on the far side of the Atlantic. So the question that has always puzzled me is why they continued to use a square sail when, because they certainly got down into the Mediterranean where lug sails and lateens were a more common sail type and much more effective in sailing in towards the wind, why they persisted in using a square sail. Something of an enigma, really. This is a reconstruction of the Gokstad ship, the one that was part of a votive burial. And we can see here that double-ended steering oar. It had ports for rowing, because clearly if you're trying to get out of a fjord with a headwind, you can't sail into the wind, but you can row the boat out. And then when you got clear of the land, you would hoist the single square sail. One of the problems with the square sail is that it shakes the wind when you're heading towards, even remotely towards the wind. So they had this line, which they fastened to the stem to keep the edge of the sail pointing towards the wind as tight as possible. That's called the luff of the sail. Anyway, I won't go into too much detail on the terminology, but this is not a very effective sail for sailing into the wind. But it was still used. I showed you the picture of the Nordland boat earlier on. It was still used until 100 years ago in the north of Norway by the fishermen fishing inside the Arctic Circle. There is a difference between this sail and that one. I'm sure you've spotted it. That sail is much flatter, nearer, lower down. It's called a low aspect ratio sail. And this one, the Nordland boat, is a high aspect ratio sail. It's taller than it is broad. That gives it certain advantages and certain disadvantages. The advantage of a high aspect ratio sail is that it actually sails nearer the wind. It gets a cleaner breeze because it's above rough seas, and they create air turbulence. Because it's higher, it would generally be above that air turbulence. So it's a more effective sail. The downside to it is because it's high and tall, it puts a great deal more strain on the boat and on the hull of the boat and on the ropes as well. So it's a more dangerous rig than a low aspect ratio sail. So these people knew what they were about. And this, I showed you the picture just now of the Skåldeløv ships. 5 different vessels were found in Roskilde Fjord in Denmark, and they've been very carefully restored, and they represent different types of vessel. We tend to think of the Viking ship as, you know, a one-off, all the same. They weren't. And there's certainly one of the vessels from Roskilde Fjord was what in Norse is called a langskip, a long ship. And this one, Wreck 3, was called a nar, or nor. And that means it was a cargo carrying vessel. And you can see there's a difference. This one is very long, plenty of rowing places. This one got a deeper hull for the carrying of cargo, and smaller boats were found as well. So the Skåldeløv excavations yielded different types of boats for different types of functions. Now, we do know from historical sources that Alfred obviously feared what the Vikings were capable of. He had every reason to. And in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, dated 896, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is the main source of information about what was going on during the Viking raids. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for 896 says this, that Alfred could timberen langskippen ongen the ashes. Then Alfred ordered timber long ships to be built against those ashes. Ashes were the Vikings. They were sometimes in some sources called the Ashmen because their boats were made out of ash, very light and very pliable, a good building material for ships. So Alfred actually ordered long ships to be built to really defend what was left of his kingdom of Wessex against the Vikings. They were twice as long as those Viking ships. These are large, large ships. Some after Alex Ara, some Mauer. Some had 60 oars, that's 30 on each side, and some were longer. Daar waren echter je swifteren je en welchteren je echt eren van the other. They were both swifter, steadier, and higher in the water than those others, than those Viking ships. Neither ne on Frisisch Shatne, ne on Danish. They were not built on the Frisian model, nor on the Danish model. Botten, so himself thuchte that he nit withdraw on Mechten. To him, Alfred seemed most appropriate. So Alfred, King Alfred, had his own view on the sort of vessels that he wanted built to basically guard against Viking raids. And from this we glean how sizable those vessels were, and the fact that there were a variety of different vessels, albeit clinker-built, double-ended, but within that basic generic type, many different sorts of ships were being built. This is one of the great Viking ship burials. This is the Oseberg ship. And of course, what's interesting about the Oseberg ship, go back to it, is the steering position. They didn't have rudders, they had steering oars, and the steering oars were always on the starboard side, presumably because most people are right-handed. And in Old English, the starboard side is called a steerboard, the steering side. There was no Anglo-Saxon word for port, that was called the backboard. In Old Norse, this was called the stjornborthe, the steering side. And so you can see we get our word starboard from the fact that historically this was the side where the steering oar was always set. And most working boats, even today, I think if you go down to St Ives Harbour, every working boat, fishing boat, would use the starboard side as the working side. Very unusual. I can't think offhand of any boat that I've ever seen where the port side is the working side of the boat. And I was always assumed it's something to do with right-handedness, but I don't know. So 834 AD, we get a steering oar on the starboard side. And here we have one of the Gotland stones of the 8th century AD. And it wasn't until the 12th century that we get the first evidence of the appearance of what's called a stern post rudder. And you can see this is from the Winchester font. So a stone carving giving us the first evidence that we no longer have a side oar mounted here, but we have a stern post rudder, which was dynamically much more effective as a steering mechanism than a side oar or a side rudder. This is a particular type of vessel as well, a departure from what we've seen so far. It's kind of a banana-shaped vessel, clearly again clinker built, but it doesn't have a stem post or a stern post. The ends come together. It's called the hulk. And from about the 12th century, these became the standard cargo vessels of the Hanseatic period. And they would have been seen certainly in the coastal areas around here. And the Bremen cog is one of these large vessels, Hanseatic vessels, that was discovered in the Bremen, in the river, and was excavated, I think in the 1960s. And here we enter a different sort of seagoing vessel altogether. The Bremen cog has been reconstructed. Now, the Hanseatic League was a great trading league of vessels. And this is a reconstruction of the Hanseatic, the Bremen cog. Interesting as well in that not only is there a departure from the sort of slightly more shapely Viking ship design, we've got this angular development between the keel and the stem post, and there with the stern post, and again if you see a stern post rudder. But the other interesting departure is that here we've got clinker building above the waterline, but below the waterline we've got carville building. So from the 14th century, 13th, 14th century, we begin to see the development of different ship construction techniques becoming prevalent in Northern Europe. Yes, they built a replica of the Bremen cog. Here she is sailing. And the important thing about them is the sheer size of the hull and the cargo carrying capacity of the ship for carrying bulk materials. The Hanseatic League was a big trading league. And again, just to make the point that these are vessels that we would have seen almost certainly around the coast of Cornwall. This is an illustration found on a piece of graffiti from Charles Thomas's excavation at Crane Gadreeby. And there's absolutely no doubt that whoever carved this way back in the early medieval period or the early Middle Ages had in mind exactly that sort of cog vessel that we've just seen excavated at Bremen. So these are graffiti from Crane Gadreeby. I haven't been able to get the excavation report, so I can't tell you any more than this is a Charles Thomas excavation. And these graffiti almost certainly depict the sort of Hanseatic cogs that we've seen excavated from Bremen. And the wreck that I started off telling you about from Viberstrand in Denmark was exactly that. It was one of these Hanseatic cogs, and I said it was carrying a cargo that's been lifted here of Cornish granite. So almost certainly we would have had that kind of vessel sailing around the coast of Cornwall in the early Middle Ages. Another type of vessel also began to appear at this time, a vessel called the hulk. We know they were called cogs and hulks because of documentary information about cargoes and what they carried and the sort of vessels that carried them. There's reference to cogs and there's reference to hulks, and I'll end with this slide now because I said I would only go on for the hour. This is a town seal, and the town seal is from New Shoreham in Sussex, and before it was called New Shoreham, it was actually called Hulksmouth. That was the original name of New Shoreham. And the town seal actually depicts, if you see again, a banana-shaped vessel with castles there and there. And again, interestingly, only a single square mast with, or single midships mast with a single square sail. And by the time of this seal, 1295, we become aware that cogs and hulks were becoming the prevalent cargo-carrying vessels that would have been seen in the waters around Cornwall. So just to end, although we don't have vessels actually found in the coast of Cornwall, we do have plenty of evidence for the vessels that would have been sailing around here. And I suspect in years to come, if ever the opportunity arises, there are obvious places where one could begin to look for ancient vessels. We've got the secondary material like the church mural at Bree, but somewhere like the Saltings, silted up, is a very, very convenient place where you might well find in years to come remains of medieval vessels, because we know that this was an important sea link between the north coast and the south coast, because it was navigable some way up the River Hale, much further than it is now, and so vessels would have sailed as far up as they could. They would have portage overland to avoid the dangerous route around Land's End. So the Marazion Marshes and the Saltings are prime places where you might expect in years to come to find ships' timbers of some antiquity. Thank you very much.